Hello and welcome back everyone. This is part one of a short series where we go through the build on this Tamiya 132nd F4U-1D Corsair. A very nice kit. That's it. Almost done. Sitting on the shelf. To give a bit of background on how I ended up with this kit, it was originally bought by my son in Singapore when he was in the army. That's about 4 years ago. Then obviously some moves and travels on the way, and I ended up with it. So it was partially built, at least the engine maybe 80% and the cockpit 20-30%, something like that. I had opened it a couple times, done a little bit of pre-painting. So that was how it ended up in my stash. I think I've had it about 2 years or so sitting there. Generally these things irritate me because I just don't like having partially built, in this case, kit sitting around. It's just too easy to lose track of things. I think I held off for quite a while because the decals were missing. So you get into those type of problems. They actually turned up in another box. Again, that's part of that moving and getting dumped with things that kids leave behind or pass back to you. The molding and sprues, the tooling in general is excellent quality. It's what you expect from Tamiya, to be honest. Some people complain about that. I definitely don't. I think this is the 2013 issue, which was reboxed in 2017, so it's not old at all. There's no complaints that way. That's the engine as I received it. Now with the engine, there were a few parts missing, definitely the induction ring and a couple other odds and ends, but it is well done, so I can't blame anyone for that but myself. There were a few parts floating around in the box as well, including the firewall, which I screwed up, and I'll mention more of that as we get there. In this episode, if you call it that, what we're going to do is go through the fuselage, the engine, the cockpit. There's big chunks of it done, but there's still plenty there to see and do. The stand itself, as I say, this is one of Tamiya's top-of-the-line kits, so it's an excellent stand, but there is an issue that I did have, and this probably applies across the board. There wasn't a gimbal there, so you are limited with how you can mount the plane, and I would say that that was probably my big issue with the kit in general. Straight up, the problem is it's not really designed to be configurable across the board, and that is a bit disappointing for a higher end kit, or I'll put it another way, an expensive kit. The molding, tooling is excellent, superb, and it's a nice change for me to get back to a large scale plane. They are my preference, but even I end up in those moments where I'm thinking, wow, this is a lot of work. I think just for the blue, I used an entire bottle of blue paint. So that maybe puts it into perspective. You can see how well the clear parts are done. And for those that haven't done 1/32, sometimes I do think it's easier because you can see a lot more clearly what you're doing. Obviously, there was a bit of junk in the box, odds and ends, so I had to clear that out. But you can see just the extra detail that you do get with the large scale planes. One other thing I'd say about the large scale, or in this case 1/32, I think it gives you a better appreciation of the engineering that goes into it. There's the decals. They were MIA for 2 years, turned up in another box. Again, that's just part of that irritating moving about. The masks themselves that come with these higher end Tamiya kits, I never use them. I don't understand why they can't go the extra mile. Well, it's not even extra mile, it's like extra inch, and just do some of the pre-cutting, because you can spend as long messing around trying to cut them out as just doing it yourself. There is some etched metal that comes with this. Again, sometimes I think it's almost superfluous. On the seat belts or harnesses, I did use them, but on the whole I always end up regretting using etched metal for harnesses, purely because they can look be a bit hard to configure. That's the cockpit itself. I've come back through and done most of the consoles, not the instrument panel, the seat, which we'll get into in a moment. So you can see there just that extra detail. That part there was one of the footboards I did scratch build just with some evergreen styrene. One of the things I really did like about this kit is the manual that come with it. So they actually have real-world photos of a restored Corsair from somewhere. So if you're into exactly color matching, you can do that. The booklet itself, I think they could sell alone. There's a lot of interesting info, not just on the plane itself, but just some of the history. I think it's talking about USS Gambier Bay there and so on. One thing I would point out here, I use Mr. Hobby Interior Green, and you can see that it's not an exact match. For cockpits in general, I prefer to be a bit lighter because, to point out the obvious, it can get a bit dark, and I've heard of like the scale color and so on. So there's the schemes that come with the kit. You can always go aftermarket. The instructions, typical Tamiya. If you've ever done Tamiya kits, you'll not be surprised at all seeing this. The only difference is there's a lot more to it. It's really that simple. But as usual, they're normally clear. There was one or two parts where I was like, could be a bit better, but no great dramas. I haven't done extended wings. That's a whole thing in itself. The pilot, in this case, I did do with oil paints, and I'm glad I did. I hadn't done it before, but I do think you get a much better finish. I'll probably do a video on that at some point. It's just one of those, I think you get a better or more realistic and subtle colors. So there he goes in. There's a couple bits to finish there. One is the oxygen tube and his goggles, and it's one of those ones I kept coming back to and cleaning up here and there. So the cockpit comes together really nice. It's pretty sweet, and at that point I'm really happy with it. The engine itself, the mistake I did make in my desperation to get rid of some of the odds and ends is I put the firewall on too early, and that caused some headaches later on, which we'll get to. There was, as I say, bits floating around in the box, so I was actually in a hurry to almost get them glued down and bedded in. Here's just, I think this is one of the oxygen cylinders, and I do have vague memory about where that caused some problems. One thing I've never really understood is why some of these parts are clear. I have a feeling it might be going back to the days when the metallic paints weren't so good. What I'm doing here is just coming over with acrylics. Generally what I'll do is use lacquers for the bulk of the work. Like after using lacquers, there's no way I'd go back to acrylics for especially large areas. But then what I'll do is I'll use acrylics, and I've got a whole bunch of odds and ends there, everything from Vallejo, MiG, AK. I'll use them over the lacquers. The main reason is if I mess up, I can always easily wash it off. And generally they're, like I say, these days they're pretty good quality. So you can see there just the extra detail that you get in the larger scales. There's the seat bulkhead, I guess it's called. I just like coming in and doing some of this extra detail. It's almost therapeutic for me after work some days. Even in the large scale, you're probably not going to see this again, especially as it goes into the cockpit and I've got aircrew in there and so on. But from my point of view, it's just fun to do, and I think it's always good practice, because if you do the parts that are hidden, you'll become more confident on the parts that are going to be visible. This is just, I call it super glue, but cyanoacrylate, CA, onto, I guess it's a etch metal frame that'll sit in there. I think that's radio stacks, or, well, it's probably not radio, but you can see there it just pushes in, and that'll go onto the fuselage. I would say that definitely for this type of work, good tweezers do make a difference. This is where I was coming from with the metal harnesses. I just always end up unhappy with them. They're just too rigid. Not in gluing them in and actually fixing them, but where it does cause problems is on, what would you say, bending them to shape. So you can see there I use just any acrylics that I've got sitting on my desk. And on this oxygen cylinder, which I assume it is, it's a good example of coming over with the acrylics. I can just wash it off. For this type of work, I definitely do use good brushes. It just makes life so much easier. It depends what I'm doing. I'll save my good brushes definitely for this type of work where I'm doing the bands or straps or extra fine detail work, and I'll have a range of them. So occasionally if you watch my videos, you will see me using scrappy ones that I can get away with. At this point, I'm really just going through some extra detailing. I can't say I'm an expert on these cockpits, so I just follow the instructions. I do browse or use Google to double check things at times. I've been around long enough not to just completely trust the documentation that comes with the kit. In this case, it was just a few, I guess, emergency switches or important switches if they're painted red from my point of view. So this is just detailing now on some of these instrument panels. Again, I'm not exactly sure what's what. I probably should sit down and read through. So at this point, the cockpit or the cockpit sub-assembly is pretty much ready to go. There's always a bit of cleanup. You can see there where I've come through red, just largely just following the instructions. There's no great surprises. I do come back and clean up the pilot a bit. And at this point, largely we're onto the fuselage. There is no problems at all on getting this to fit together. It's essentially perfect. I can't say anything bad about it at all. If you are building this kit, one thing I'd say just to double check before you do start gluing the two halves together is to make sure you've got all your struts, in particular on the tail wheel assembly, because there is one that goes up there. I almost forgot, so just beware of that. Again, it's not a huge panic, but just double check that you have got all those struts in place. Some of these are purely for strengthening, but in the case of the tail wheel assembly, you will need that later on. What I tend to do is obviously test fit, and as you can see here, there's no trouble at all. And then I will take my time, work essentially around all of the seams and pins to make sure that we're good, and I'll also do that when it comes to gluing. The reason is, if you try and glue, especially in this case, large assemblies together all in one piece, what can happen is you'll end up with parts of it drying, parts of it wet, and sooner or later you're going to get fingerprints of glue all around the place. The other advantage, and this probably applies to the smaller scales, is there's enough flexibility in the plastic that you can take your time, make sure you've got really good fit on each section, and then just work your way around. Don't try and do it all in one go. It'll just end up, well, you could get away with it, but that would be my advice. Just take your time and do each part. And you can see here, as I'm doing each part, I'm adding a bit of tape just to make sure it's secure. And this will pull together really nicely. The other thing, and we'll come to it in a second, I suppose, is one nice thing I do appreciate Tamiya's done there is the upper part of the fuselage, there's a separate piece that goes in. With the thin cement, I'm always cautious of it, but for times like this, it is perfect because, again, that capillary action, you don't need to rub it and smear it all over the place. Let the glue do the work. So you can see here, in an ideal situation, a few well-placed drops and it'll flow through. And the other nice thing about the thin cement is it does dry quickly. I still will use a bit of tape just to make sure everything is seated properly. So here I am just poking and prodding my way around this fuselage, making sure it's all lined up. One of the things you do have to watch out for on these larger scale planes isn't that there's any poor fit or anything in this case on the Tamiya, but if you do put glue down and it's not right, it can be a real pain to undo it just because of the sheer amount of plastic or the volume. So at this point it's coming together very nicely. I'm really just test fitting that engine bulkhead, gorgeous R2800 engines. I don't know if you can have a favourite engine, but it would definitely be one of mine. I'm really just test fitting at this point, having a play with it. You can see all the tape on the important junctions or joints, and just making sure that it all sits nicely. I do let it sit overnight just to make sure that it's such a major component is good. There's that upper part of the fuselage, and I really like that. Solves a few problems. So all good at this point. There is some drilling required. In this case, I think it's the radio mast, and later on we'll get to things like the drop tanks. Again, no huge surprises. I do like, in this case, that neat way of doing the upper part of the fuselage. What I'm doing here is coming along with regular cement, and I'm being very careful, because what I do is I let it dry a few minutes, because then when I push this together, no glue comes out. So it's almost a way of internally gluing it. Again, it's not a huge drama if you do have some glue come out, but if you can avoid that problem, then why even go there? So it's definitely looking more like a plane, and we're onto the engine. I do give this a code, I think it's Mr. Surfacer 1500, because I know I'm going to be coming back here doing some hand brushing and detailing. The next part I've come over is with gunmetal, and I'm really just focusing on the engine rather than the firewall and exhaust itself. One part that was missing is the induction manifold, but I wasn't going to get too hung up on it at this point. Sometimes you just want to keep moving, and especially with a kit like this where it's sat around for years. After the gunmetal, I come over it with some aluminium, and I actually just like that multi-layered effect. One of the interesting things I've moved to over the years is away from solid colours. I like to have a bit of variety. Here I'm doing I think it's a bell housing, just in some light blue. I did look around at reference pics, and these are 2800s. Well, they're produced in the thousands, so I think there's a bit of variety on the actual colours. My airbrushing, there's no great mystery to it. The only reason I can do this fine detail work is practice. I wouldn't even put it down to having nice tools or anything. I actually think it's more important to understand your tools or be familiar with them as much as anything. At the end of the day, it's just practice. My early airbrushing was horrible. So at this point, I'm really just coming back, and as I said, I like to come back and detail it. I was originally thinking of doing this on the ground with the engine visible, the cowling open. I did change my mind as I realized the engine wasn't exactly in the shape that I wanted it to be. What I'm doing now is really just coming back and trying to get a bit of that gritty exhaust. I'm not too bothered about the color, and this is still semi-damp acrylic. I think it was just rust color. I'm just trying to create that exhaust effect, just that rusty exhaust pipe. And that has always happened. If you've ever worked on engines, I think it's the heat and everything really plays havoc. I did come back and try and do a little bit of extra detailing just with brass wire to at least emulate the look of the Pratt & Whitney there. There's a bit of fiddling around, and again, partly I just enjoy some of this work. For some reason I like doing engines, even though I know a lot of it's not going to be visible. It's just one of those, I suppose, something where, especially after work, I'm not having to get out a lot of tooling, and I can just concentrate on some of this lighter detail, almost no-brainer type things. Some people like doing figures or cockpits and so on. For some reason, I've got a little bit of a fetish going for the engines. Each to their own, I suppose. What I'm doing now is adding just some very light, I wouldn't even call it weathering, it's almost usage, because even if it's come from the factory, it's had to fly out there. Interestingly, I think the Corsair, and someone will correct me if I'm wrong, was not used by the Navy at first. They didn't meet carrier qualification. The US Marines picked it up and it was first deployed at Guadalcanal. And then the Royal Navy, I guess they were using whatever they had at the time given the circumstances, and basically figured out how to make it work on a carrier, especially the long nose, visibility issues, all of that. So that angled approach or arced approach, I'm not sure what it's called, onto the flight deck, that come from them. Then the US Navy went back to it. I think they upgraded things like the oleo tubes. Basically it was too bouncy originally, so they solved those problems, and the rest is history. One of those iconic planes of the period. For some reason I've picked up a few Corsairs. I've got a Korean War one there and so on. Here I'm just really, like I say, almost enjoying myself adding these extra detailing to the engine. Again, it's probably never going to be seen, but I just enjoy doing it, and I'm quite happy with where it's at. The exhaust's there. One thing I would say on these larger planes, if you've never done them, do be careful on the exhaust, because it will affect installation of the engine later on, and especially on something like this, there's a bunch of them, so take your time and make sure you got that right. So here I'm just coming back. I think this is just very dilute acrylic, just to add a little bit of realism, because as I say, even if it's from the factory, it still had to be started up, tested, flown out. There was a few hours on it before it even got anywhere. So that's the effect I'm trying to create. We're at the point now where the cowlings come on, and this is where the engine bulkhead does come back to bite me. I wasn't a fan of the way the cowlings mounted directly onto those points that you just saw. It just creates almost a super tight locked in fit. So here we are, episode 1 done, with one engine, one cockpit, with the pilot and the fuselage still all taped together, and a slowly increasing amount of mess on my desk, and that's going to get a lot worse as we proceed. So in the next episode we're going to get onto the wings and what really makes it start to look like a proper aeroplane. The Corsair really starts to come alive. The episode after that is going to be much more on the painting, which is an adventure in itself in this large scale. I do try and paint as much as possible as I go along, but in reality, sooner or later, you've got to deal with some pretty large paint jobs. Like I say, Corsair's big, it's big scale, and it definitely adds up. I hope you've enjoyed that, and I definitely hope you'll stick around for the rest of the episodes. They'll be coming pretty much in the next week or so. Everything's all done. It's just really a question of pacing them out a bit to keep YouTube happy and keep my sanity at least reasonably okay. I can't say I'm a huge fan of editing. So there's definitely a fair bit more to go, but that's the rough breakdown. Next episode is making it look like a Corsair, at least mechanically or structurally, and then we'll get on to much more of the finishing and the painting. As always, do like, comment, subscribe. Does make a big difference. It sort of, keeps the faith on my end. As always, stay safe out there in what seems a pretty crazy world lately. Maybe it always has been, who knows. But stay safe, enjoy your modelling, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks again.